Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the URU Town Hall on grading system reforms from Cambridge to California. My name is Julia Michaels. I'm Director of Development and Strategic Partnerships for URU. I'm standing in for Steve Dandino, our fearless host today, as he recovers from his illness. And I will just get things started. This is a hot topic that we've decided to make into a full-blown town hall. It's going to be a great discussion today. We've got a good lineup of speakers and panelists. I want to turn it over to my colleague, Michael Dennin, who's Vice Provost for Teaching and Learning and Dean of the Division of Undergraduate Education at UC Irvine, to get the conversation started. Michael?
Thanks, Julia. Welcome to everyone. I know some people are still slowly coming in, but just wanted to welcome everyone. Archie and I have been working on this with Steve on a couple of different town halls that we might have throughout the year, and it started at the national meeting. We recently, in the UC system, had a math congress, and Carl Wyman was our keynote speaker at that. And he talked a lot about STEM education, but a couple of things that came out of that, I think, provide a nice intro into what we want to discuss today. At one point in his talk, and this is not quite a direct quote, but he basically said, the attitudes and beliefs about students matter. Roughly, there are faculty that believe that there are innate variations in ability, and education is meant to select the best. And there are faculty that believe all students can be successful if teaching and content are matched to them. It's worth noting that of these two options, a stated goal of the recent NASM consensus study, which Archie chaired and I was on and URU has talked a lot about, is very much aligned with the second. It makes the strong statement, we need to provide all students with a STEM experience that allows them to achieve their goals. I would argue we need to provide them with that experience, whatever field they're in. This is not just a STEM question. The other interesting thing that came up, not only is there our attitudes towards students' abilities, but what is the question of rigor? He was asked about, well, if you brought in participation, do you threaten rigor? And that perhaps, how do we deal with that? And he did raise the issue that we probably need to question our idea of rigor, that it's often very ill-defined, not well thought out. And even under our current system, too often students can get through 4 years with, quote, good grades, and they often cannot actually do what we really want. So these two ideas, I think, are a good framing for a discussion around grades. Specifically, that's what we'll be talking about today. I just want to let everyone know this is the first of several events we plan. We're going to have a follow-up event that focuses specifically on, well, once you've talked about grades, how do you actually assess student learning? So we're bringing together a panel. People have done research in that area. So we're looking at Tim McKay, Linda Adler Kessler, and Richard Aram as some potential panelists for that. So look for that announcement. And today we will kick things off. We've intentionally invited our speakers from Harvard and MIT to highlight two things that have been in the public, Harvard's discussion of grade inflation and MIT's careful review and implementation of pass, no pass, which we think are nice places to start. So with that, I will do the classic vice provost thing as having been introduced to introduce someone. Archie, I will introduce Archie, who will then take over and run the panel.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. And again, thank you all for being here. So Gillian and Kate, I'll ask you to introduce yourself as a part of the first question. But, as I was thinking about how I wanted to start this conversation with both of you, my first thought was to kind of go back in time and maybe date myself a little bit and use Paul Harvey as a starting point. So for those of you who do not remember Paul Harvey, he did a radio show and kind of it was about the rest of the story. So your work has been in the news a lot. What is the rest of the story that you would like to share with people about what's going on at both Harvard and MIT? So Gillian, why don't we start with you first, please?
Okay, sure. Thank you for that, Archie. So I'm Gillian Pierce. I'm Associate Dean for Undergraduate Education at Harvard. I've been in this role for about 6 years now. Prior to that, I was Assistant Provost for Academic Assessment at Boston University. So, learning outcomes and assessment are something that I think about a lot, and it's certainly factored into our discussions about grading at Harvard. I'll go back. a little bit in time just to say how we got here and what maybe isn't making the news about our discussions on campus. So we when we first convened a group to review grade inflation, it was at the prompting of faculty. At the end of the year, when we announced the cutoffs for summa cum laude, we were having to calculate GPAs to 5 decimal points to actually come up with that cutoff. And every year faculty would say to us, what is going on here? We have to tackle this. So it was really the faculty crying out for some kind of collective action on this question. So the dean of the college at the time, and that was back in 2021, convened a group from the Office of Undergraduate Education, where I work, to do a kind of descriptive report on grading. So what is the data? Are there distinctions between and among course types, across departments, divisions, faculty rank? Like, what are the trends? And in our research, we actually came across an 1894 report bemoaning grade inflation at Harvard. So this is not a new issue, and I think it's not unique to our institutions either, just to say. But we did find, yes, that grades are on the rise. 2/3 of students last year received flat A grades, 85% A range grades. So, 85% of students are getting A's and A minus at Harvard. So that in itself would not be a problem for us, I think, based on, the framing that Michael gave about excellence and wanting students to meet the learning outcomes. We do want that. I think that our concerns come because we have been able to identify what we've been lovingly calling distortionary pressures on grading on campus. So these are things like concerns about the high correlation between high scores on course evaluations and grades. The inverse correlation we see between workload and grades. Concerns about how grading can be used as a tool to attract enrollments or interest in certain departments or concentrations. Faculty desire to be judged favorably by students. Concerns that giving a lower grade will negatively impact students' academic or professional trajectories, their eligibility for prizes. So these pressures are part of a broader landscape where we determined that in and of itself, we wouldn't be concerned that students were getting high grades if we thought they were meeting our goals. But faculty again and again were telling us, I'm not assigning the grades I think students should be receiving, and these are the reasons. And I think a lot of also concern about faculty, students spending a lot of time outside the classroom. We think in part to distinguish themselves in ways that they're not able to do in the classroom. So part of our efforts to recenter academics as the arena where we want students to be focusing our efforts is part of all this grading reform work. So we convened yet another group following the first report that surfaced these pressures and showed the data. We created a grading dashboard for departments and faculty so they could see their own grades historically over the past 20 years in the courses they've been teaching. They can compare themselves to their peers. Really, we wanted to start off that way. But we started to realize that we had some faculty really responding to that, some departments really responding to that, some not, some saying, I never will. I give the grades I want and it's going to be all A's, and I dare you to tell me not to do that. And, actually we think there are courses where that's perfectly appropriate. So I can say more about how we've created a sort of carve out for that. But so we realized we actually needed to take a step further and faculty were crying out for it. They were saying, just tell us what to do, because if I act on my own, I think I'm going to suffer negative consequences. Students are going to go over to the other department. They're going to go over to the other class. They're going to ding me on my course evaluations. So this is where we engaged a group of faculty and just say relatively briefly. So we shared actually our full course grade data with a faculty member in the Department of Computer Science who crunched literally every scenario you can possibly imagine. He looked at Z-score grading. He looked at, what if we put median scores on transcripts? What if we introduce an A+ grade? How would that impact different divisions? And how would that? So it was really a very data-driven process that involved, a really engaged group of faculty. And in short, the proposal is that we introduce a 20% cap on A grades, not A- grades, and that's important because our faculty handbook indicates that A- is the grade that indicates full mastery of material. So we will not limit that in any way because we think all students can and should achieve full mastery. But the A grade is reserved for distinction, and that to us, it makes sense that there would be a cap on that. So 20% plus 4, people have commented on the plus 4. This gives faculty some leeway in a semester where you just do have those extra students that are really incredible, and also in a very small class, high level, small class, that could mean everybody in the class. So it's kind of, I think, giving us some wiggle room. And then that we will create an internal ranking by average percentile rank for grades, honors and internal purposes. And this is a system where faculty will be able to input raw grading scores, so not letter grades, which we know are a very, I'm going to quote Michael Dennin here, lossy system that you can actually put in, precision grades that your score sheet essentially, and the registrar will calculate a percentile rank that will be used for those internal purposes. So this is really in response to an idea that we owe our students a functioning grading system where grades send a good signal. A sense of their strengths and weaknesses, a sense of their preparation for follow-on coursework, and that communicate well to employers and admissions committees, and really trying to help us get to a place where grades can be really aligned with good pedagogy, good assessment, lead students toward desired learning outcomes, creates conditions for students willing to put in the effort to achieve mastery and even distinction over the course of their academic careers. So I hope I didn't go on too long. That's a little bit of the history of how we got to where we are and what's actually being proposed at Harvard.
Well, thank you, Gillian. And I'll certainly have follow-up questions, but Kate, I want to hear the story at MIT. What is the story there?
Yeah, thanks, Archie. So I'm Kate Weishaar. I wear many hats at MIT, but perhaps most relevant to this discussion, I was involved in our effort to experiment with grading policies a few years back, with the stated intention to encourage more exploration in the first year. So to understand why grading has anything to do with exploration, you have to understand the unique pressures on MIT students and how our grading system has evolved. So it started in the 60s when the faculty recognized that given the increased diversity of the first year class, students were coming in with wildly different levels of preparation, and they needed some time to adjust to the rigors of MIT. So they put in place a full year pass-fail system. So all first year students received hidden grades. They could see that they had done C-level work in a class, but that would just be converted to a pass. And that system evolved over time in response to varying things. So initially they found that students would take way too many classes while they had the pass no pass option. So they put in a credit limit. They realized that it didn't make a ton of sense to put failing grades on first year students' transcripts. So they changed it from pass fail to pass no record, which is what we currently use, which means that if you fail a class in your first year, there is no record of it on your transcript that you ever took the class. And so that system was in place for many years. And then around 2000, 2001, they realized that the first year is not a monolith. And the second semester students were behaving quite differently from the first semester students. They were looking at the fact that they had this pass no record option, and having gotten used to the nature of MIT classes, have figured out exactly how much work they need to do to get the C that qualifies as passing under a pass no record system. And it was not serving as an on-ramp, but rather as a excuse to do very little in the classes they cared the least about. So around that time, they switched it to be pass no record solely for the first semester and ABC no record for the second semester, so that students would still get letter grades. But if they got a D or an F, they would have no record of the class and could take it again in the future. So that's the system we've had for the past more than 20 years now. But we also noted that students would take our very rigorous science core classes, which are our general institute requirements. They would choose the ones that they felt the least confident about to take in their first semester because they had the pass no record grading. And this would also prevent them from starting to explore majors, taking things that really interested them, or otherwise just expanding their horizons in the first semester. So we wanted to see if we could use different grading policies to experiment with the motivation of students. And so what we did was we put in place a system where the 6 science core subjects, which are Calc 1, Calc 2, Physics 1, Physics 2, Chem, and Bio, could be taken pass no record at any time. So this started with the entering class in fall of 2018 and continued with the following class. And we looked at their hidden grades, so how they performed in those classes not on their transcript, as well as their performance in other classes, how they were spending their time, what things they chose to register for. And we saw a lot more exploration, but we also saw that a lot of students were behaving in a way that we somewhat expected based on the data from the 90s, where students were kind of slacking off in their classes after the first semester. So based on the findings from that, we decided to put in place a new system that would be class agnostic. So students could choose to use it on their science core GIRs as they had done before, but they could also use it to explore electives, make up for the fact that they got sick one semester or had a family emergency and didn't do as well as they had hoped. And we call this system flexible PNR. So the way that this is set up is that students see their final grade for the semester, and then before a set time in the following semester, they have to decide whether they want to convert that grade to a pass or no record. And notably, a D can count as passing a class if it's a letter grade, but not under a pass no record system. So if a student gets a D, they can choose to make it no record and take the class again. Or not take the class again if they decided that that was not what they were going to major in, or if it was an elective. So students use this in a number of ways. Some of them just like having it as a safety net. It makes them feel more secure knowing that if they completely mess up, that they have this option available to them later. Some of them will plan to use it for certain subjects. Some of them get a B in a class and then have a crisis of faith and deliberate whether it's worth using one of their flexible PNRs on this, because we limit them to 4 over the course of their 4 years at MIT. So some hoard them religiously and some will use them all really early and then realize that they don't have any left. So there's certainly some elements of stress and different dynamics associated with that. But we found that in general that it adds a little bit of flexibility and creates space for exploration later on in students' time at MIT. And then most recently, we're kind of looking forward to assessing that policy soon. It's been in place for about 5 years now, but we're also beginning to look more holistically at grades. We've been observing what our neighbors down the street are doing at Harvard and thinking about how we might approach that further. And I've been staffing a task force looking at our undergraduate program generally, specifically our general institute requirements, but also many of the policies. And after spending many of our meetings talking about grading, we concluded that we needed a whole new task force just to focus on grading. So one of our recommendations is to create that task force. So hopefully there'll be much more to come.
Kate and Gillian, thank you for giving us that background. I think it's very helpful. One of the things that I heard kind of from both of you, and maybe I'll take us a step out, is what is the purpose of providing a grade? I mean, I've heard from both of you. I mean, I've heard many. I heard multiple from you, Gillian and Kate. I heard from you more on the kind of motivating what the students do. I mean, as we're thinking about what grading is, assuming that we're going to do it, what do you think the main purpose of it is and should be?
Yeah, well, I'm happy to jump in on that one. And I think, so there are obviously multiple audiences for grades, and that's one of the things that makes this so challenging, right? Is that we have the internal purposes for where we do some ranking of students for things like Phi Beta Kappa and honors. We were having students who, didn't realize that they weren't the very best until they didn't get an honors distinction at graduation. So we were sending that signal too late. So I think for us, recognizing that employers and, kind of honors and prizes and fellowships are one audience for grades, that really, primarily for us, feedback on learning is what we think should be the primary reason for assigning grades. So we have had many discussions about, well, can't we just give feedback then? I hear you're having Josh Eiler coming, and we've talked about ungrading, we've talked about mastery grading, we've talked about, well, if everybody's getting an A, maybe every class could just be sat unsat or pass no record or whatever the distinction might be. That has been a serious discussion on our campus about, but I think we feel like that we rather try to resurrect the system we have of using grades to give feedback on learning, because it is part of faculty culture here, and we think that by having every class subject to the same rules about the number of distinction grades you can give, that it will actually help us focus again on that primary mission of focusing on student learning and getting out of this what everybody feels is a rat race of, I give you a 5 on your course evaluation, you give me an A on my paper, everybody's happy, let's not look into it too much. We're really worried about the learning that's not happening. So we think that it is an important motivator for students. So I guess that's how we think about the primary reason for grades.
Kate, do you all feel the same way at MIT?
So we're a little bit different. We don't give graduation honors, so we actually try very hard to avoid ranking our students. We strictly forbid grading on a curve, although we do allow professors to set what they call grade cutoffs. So if they give an exam and the average is a 50, then a 50 could be a B, which doesn't always make mathematical sense, but makes sense given how our faculty tend to write exams. And so we really try to push away from this idea that grades are used to rank students. But of course, we have 40% of our students go straight to grad school, so they will be ranked against other students in that application process. So they still see their grades as a ranking mechanism in that respect, even if they're not necessarily being compared to their MIT peers. And then, of course, I mentioned a lot about motivation. I think that's even if students are not necessarily going to grad school and don't necessarily need to get straight A's, they do have that kind of ingrained belief that they have to be an A student in every respect because that's how they got to MIT to begin with. So just the workload required to get an A is definitely more than the workload required to get a B, and students will put in that extra work just to get that letter grade. So measuring learning, of course, is kind of the goal of what we want grades to be for, but it's not always serving that function, especially given the loose-grained nature of an A versus a B.
Yeah. And I mean, do you think that by giving, and what I was really intrigued about, Kate, what you talked about is the agency that I heard in terms of allowing students to be able to decide in certain circumstances. I mean, do you feel that having students have agency over how they're evaluated and when grades matter and don't matter could ultimately lead to us having a more concrete conversation about, grades and learning and kind of get that motivation in the right direction?
I think so. For some students, that's definitely true. Students who are heading to industry straight after MIT, if we can have a conversation with them and say, like, look, you don't need an A, you need to be able to master these skills and demonstrate that you've mastered these skills. And what does that look like? And how can we do that without relying on a number? That can be a very productive conversation. Whereas students who are applying to medical school have a very different conversation with their advisors. They don't use the flex PNRs option, like by and large. They still have the first semester PNR because that's required for everyone. But they think very critically about how and when to take classes to get A's in all of the subjects that they're going to need for medical school. And that will take a nationwide conversation, I think, before we can change that behavior.
And you haven't seen any adverse effects in terms of medical school acceptances or anything yet about having that PNR in the first year?
Well, we've had it since the 60s, so they're kind of used to it at this point. Yeah.
Gillian, do you have any thoughts about this? How, I mean, because part of what I, was intriguing to me about what Kate said, right, is allowing students to have agency, right, to be able to say, like, this is the area where I feel I've really done my best work. I'd like to be able to demonstrate that versus another area where maybe I was exploring and maybe that isn't really the thing. So I'm trying to kind of figure out, like, how do we think about grades not as everything that we did, but maybe a curated way of students being able to demonstrate to an outside world about what it is that they learn and what it is that they think that they can do.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And it's interesting because we also thought a lot about student exploration and risk taking and really pursuing, their interests in an authentic way as at the center of the policy we've ended up with. So we kind of took the same problem and came to a slightly different conclusion. We also have a really generous pass-fail policy, so students can elect to take a course pass-fail right up until the 11th week of the semester. And so, that is one way, that is a tool that students can use, in a nearly unlimited way. They have to, some concentrations will require some courses be taken for a letter grade, but if someone wants to try something, take a risk, that is an option that they have right up until the very end of the semester. So we encourage that, and we think there's a really important place for that. What's troubling us right now is that students are using that for, well, we call it grade protection, to cover an A- grade. That to us seems really skewed, right? So our thinking is that, if every department, every course has that same limit on the number of A grades, it does free you up a little bit just to say, well, I'm actually just going to do what I like because, it's not that I can shop around and say my GPA will be better if I choose this major versus that major. So that's one way that we've thought about that. But, I think the student agency piece is really important here. Students on our campus are not happy with this grading proposal at all. It's kind of interesting that a proposal that proposes to cap grades at 20% flat A's is opposed by 80% of the students. If you kind of do that math, it's interesting that it kind of falls out that way. But we do have 20% in favor, and these are, in many cases, students who feel our system is not fair to the high achieving student. And right now we're using shadow systems to kind of document that work, and it's not ideal. But I think preserving student agency is an important goal. And that will be, I think, something we really want to keep an eye on if this proposal is approved by the faculty, is what are the adverse effects or positive effects on student agency?
And Jillian, I want to follow up something that you said a little bit earlier, talking about, this pressure about grades being both an internal signal that we want to use for motivation and helping learning versus the external signal, whether it's for honors or graduate programs or whatever. I mean, maybe is it really that our grades are really defined for the former and not for the latter, and we need to figure out just a different way to communicate to the latter group?
I mean, possibly, that is possibly the case. We did a lot of, over the course of all of this work, we've interviewed a lot of peer institutions. So Kate knows she was one of our early interviewees about their policies, because that was something we considered too, is adopting something like the MIT model. We've been interviewing admissions officers for graduate schools. We've been interviewing employers extensively. They're telling us that our transcripts, are not helpful, that they're really relying on other signals and other things in the admissions office, for in admissions process and in the hiring process. And we have some real concerns that it's reverting back to who and what is your connection. That is absolutely, sort of inimical to our goals in terms of sort of transparency and an equitable process for students. So that really worries us, that in some ways we're encouraging a kind of a shadow process that we think is not in the best interest of our students.
Yeah, and my worry, of course, is that when you don't have enough information to make a decision, you overemphasize the information that you do have, right? And you put way more importance on it than actually. And Kate, I'd love to hear your thoughts about that. That's what I worry about. I have the same worry, Gillian, that you mentioned.
I mean, yeah, absolutely. I think transcripts can only say so much. And one of my other hats is I'm in our Office of Experiential Learning. So we emphasize to students that when you're applying to whether it's graduate school or a job, you're often going to be compared to many other people who have perfect grades or near perfect grades and similar academic experiences. So it's the co-curricular opportunities, the undergraduate research, the internships that can really make a difference in how you're perceived. So that tends to resonate with students a lot. And a lot of them will even go as far as to deprioritize grades in order to spend more time in the lab or doing their personal projects that will really help them stand out, as Jillian mentioned with the extracurriculars at Harvard.
But what's interesting about that, and I 100% agree with you, Kay, right? But that gets into this idea, right? Is we could have all of our students create these really beautiful learning portfolios that show all the different things that they've done and all the different things that they learn. But at the end of the day, I don't know that a lot of the people in the external world really want to look at that and try to figure out, like, at the end of the day, they want something simple, right? They want something simple to be able to say, you tell me whether this was good and this was better, and whether there's really a difference between. I'm kind of curious as to how do we. I think we have the information to be able to provide that rich data. It's just how do we communicate it? Maybe, I'll welcome if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to be able to tell students like take the time to create this beautiful portfolio and it'll help you get a job, but as of now, that's not the case. It's more a matter of getting them to the career center and helping them talk to people about how they like craft their resume sentences to reflect the level of autonomy they had in their undergraduate research opportunity, or it's making it clear to them that doing one semester of undergraduate research is not going to get you the strong rec letter that you need for graduate school. You really need to do a sustained opportunity for several semesters at a time to get that relationship. And you should connect with the faculty member and not just the graduate student who's directly supervising you. All these kind of things that are not always obvious to students, especially first generation students, as they think about how they navigate the academy and distinguish themselves in things like graduate school applications.
Yeah, and if I could jump in, I think this is such an important question because I think we feel that grades are deeply flawed as a system, and yet we are doubling down and trying to invest in making them more functional for us because we do think there's an efficiency there. And so, I think we are, kind of going against the grain a little bit in terms of a lot of current thinking about grades. I think we're still seeing a value there, and we're really just trying to go back to having them communicate more. Because there is just a lot of information to process otherwise, and we actually think student stress is a really important consideration here. So we heard faculty say, "Oh, if I give them an A-, their mental health will suffer. They will, and I realize this is the tiny violins of Harvard, right? That's sort of the A- at Harvard, but at the same time, they are really wondering, how can I stand out? And so they think I have to have an internship between my first and second year, even though that's not common. I have to have all the clubs. I have to create a club. I have to do the clubs that we have comping for clubs, which is a competitive process. I have to do the selective clubs like consulting. And they are so busy trying to add on credentials and do all these things. We're really feeling like they're not actually slowing down to take advantage of the resources we have here. So if we can go back to a place where grades communicate more, we would love them to really write a thesis instead, focus on what's happening in the classroom, and not feel like you have to find all these other ways to, to distinguish yourself from your peers in an increasingly competitive job market and like the graduate admissions landscape.
Yeah, of course, that's just again them looking for a signal that distinguishes them, right? I mean, that's the equivalent. I mean, some of that is the equivalent of trying to find the A+ in the classroom, right? If you get into that selective organization that not everyone can get into, you try to use that as the signal when your grades may not be able to send the same signal. So I'm not always convinced that it's all part of the same. It's all really part of the same challenge that we have, which is I'm wondering whether this has been a really helpful conversation for me. Again, I'm wondering whether this is just really an external. How do we help folks understand the learning that has happened at our institutions and what our students are actually able to do? I think most of us know we have a lot of students who don't have the greatest grades, but I would put them in a lot of jobs and they would really kill it, but they're not going to get that signal if they don't have that 3.5 GPA to get through whatever a hoop is on the other side. So I'm curious as to how these conversations you've involved outside voices at this point, whether it's the employers, whether it's graduate programs. Have you all thought about how to bring those external folks into this conversation that you all are having at Harvard and MIT at this point? Kate, why don't we start with you? Have you all done that?
We mostly talk with our career center who's talking with employers, so we get kind of secondhand information in the groups that I'm working with.
Okay.
But that we get the perspectives on the transcript mattering less to employers and things like that, I would say.
Okay.
Yeah, and we have been working extensively with our top employers, meaning the ones, but just by volume that most students go to. We've been really talking with them about what would be useful for them. How do they want to be kind of what is an attractive applicant to them. And so they're the ones that are telling us that our current transcripts they don't even use. Like it's just they're not even helpful. But I think we are excited actually to partner with employers on things like, kind of a competency test upon hiring. Have you mastered the learning outcomes? The kinds of things that can happen in an interview to show student learning. We are also, with our Career Center, coaching students on how to frame their work, especially in majors that students don't think of. We call them concentrations, and concentrations that students may not think of as sort of pre-professional or that might prepare you for a career, how to really frame that on your resume or CV as what was the learning that you did? How can you sort of describe your academic trajectory in terms of transferable skills into the workplace? And I think that's been really helpful. We found, humanities in particular as a division really, really receptive to thinking about having those kinds of conversations about transferability of skills and how the research and critical thinking, processing information that you do in those majors can translate to a career. And of course, standardized tests are in the mix here too for some of these things, and that's a whole other, things like the LSAT and those kinds of things that are other postgraduate sorting mechanisms that I think people probably have mixed feelings about, but that is another tool.
So there's been a lot of questions in the chat. I'm going to try to summarize them into maybe one kind of thought for you all to kind of consider, which is either, we talked about that the employers don't see the transcript as value. Do you see other information we could add, whether context about that class that puts that grade into context, whether it's comprehensive learner records, whether it's co-curricular transcripts? I mean, is there something you see we can really do on that kind of transcript side that might try to help make some of these challenges a little bit easier for that external communication?
I mean, I think the big question for me is how are employers going to be evaluating candidates over the next 5 years, and to what extent is AI just going to be cutting out half of our students from the get-go? Because if we're not packaging things in a way that the automated systems are going to elevate our students, then it doesn't matter that they have the most beautiful comprehensive learner record in the world. No human is ever going to look at that. So I think we need more information from employers. Maybe NACE could be involved in this conversation, thinking about how we can collectively show the human skills that our students are developing to other humans.
Right. Great point.
Mm-hmm.
Gillian?
I think comprehensive learner records are a really interesting thing to pursue. I'm a big fan of portfolios, student portfolios as well. But the question of like how could they be standardized enough that someone can quickly glean something from them? Because I think there is that problem of just the amount of information you have to process when it's presented in that kind of an individualized way. So I think those are really exciting things. I think there are things we can do internally at Harvard to make our transcripts more legible. We have a really kind of Baroque system of course numbering. We have, I don't think we make as clear as we could to an external audience what a student's academic pathway has looked like because of our course naming, our course numbering, the way that levels are signaled. We just had a day-long Phi Beta Kappa meeting yesterday where, we're relying very much on, local informants from departments to say, oh, no, that's actually a really high-level course, even though it's only, level 12, so it's really not clear. You really do have to know our courses well to read our transcripts well. And so that's a very simple thing that I think we can begin to tackle.
Yeah, there's a really interesting question. I've heard it at kind of a couple of different places, right? So when we talk about grade inflation kind of broadly, we always consider it to be a monolith when I think, Gillian, in your initial reaction, it isn't always a monolith. There's really bad reasons why people give high grades, but there's actually really good learning. Like if you have actually really designed a course correctly and you really help your students learn, right? You would expect that I would hope that the grades would get better. Otherwise, why did we go through all that effort? And so is there a way that we could start thinking about grade inflation more nuanced and right in terms of the situations where it really has been because of the design of the course that has led to the learning versus folks worried about, the evaluations or that implicit contract that you kind of talked about between student the
Yeah.
detente, I will say, between the student and the faculty member that we will never, the course will get unhappy with each other if I give you a grade and you are okay with me on my course evaluation.
Yeah, no, and as I said, Archie, like when we did a report that we began researching back in 2021, that was our lens. We thought just because people are getting high grades, we're not worried. Like that's not in itself worrisome to us that grades are compressed towards the end of the scale because we don't have to have honors at Harvard if we don't have a way of calculating them. We don't, we can rethink Phi Beta Kappa, that's not necessarily a problem. It was when we dug in and saw that the grades did not actually represent, the kind of learning achievement that you're talking about, which we all agree, the best courses should allow students to meet the goals, and we want all students to be learning, and we have amazing students here. So that I think that is really where we need to focus now. And the new policy at Harvard, if it's approved, we have a lot of worries. I think it was Archie, you or maybe Michael, who started off talking about rigor. We don't want faculty to just start adding a lot of gotcha questions onto finals or make work to kind of like do some kind of distinguishing. That is not meaningful, and that would really be a step in the wrong direction. So we really do want to take time to make sure that we're having those broader conversations about pedagogy to make sure we really are we have amazing students and we want them to be learning and we want the courses to be designed for everyone to succeed. So that is really the hard work ahead, I think, regardless of the outcome of this vote on grading policy.
So if Phi Beta Kappa were to go away, if I had a magic wand, and I basically just disallowed Phi Beta Kappa to exist at Harvard, and there was no vote, and it just had to be, would that actually address a lot of the concern?
Well, it's honestly, Phi Beta Kappa wouldn't be my biggest concern because Phi Beta Kappa as an organization has such clearly defined criteria about breadth and depth of study, about language study, so there are a lot of other things you can look at, and those conversations are usually just really nuanced about, the students' accomplishment across, they usually are very high achieving and maybe in the sciences and in the humanities field. They've done language citations, they've studied abroad. Like these things are actually really clear, even without looking at the grades very often. But some of our other prizes that really are GPA focused and the way we do honors, I think those things are, in need of reform, and we have tried to move towards more multiple measures and not being so reliant on grade point average alone in those prizes. So I think we could maintain those prizes, but shift how we evaluate students for them in a more, using multiple measures that don't just involve that sort of problematic GPA.
So what would your advice be to those who are on this call, maybe thinking about going down this path, who are not at the Harvards and the MITs? There's a kind of a question about that, about the difference in the populations of the students who go to Harvard and MIT versus from some other institutions. And so what would your advice be based on y'all's experience about how to have what they should be thinking about in terms of rating, and what does that look like across all of higher ed?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I'll give the same advice that I almost always give, which is talk to your students. I think we learned so much from an interview study we did with students during the experimentation phase. They really opened up about how they think about what classes they take, how they think about whether to take things on pass no record or full grades, how they think about whether to drop a class that they're not doing as well in. So really understanding those nuanced perspectives of how students are motivated or not by certain grades in certain fields is really, really important. Maybe your students are not crazy overachieving optimizers, so you might have different challenges to face there, but really getting to know your students' psychology, I think is critical to making a policy that's going to work for them.
So I would say in a similar vein, I think it's really important to study your own institutional context. So, there are things that we learned by looking at trends at Harvard in particular that went against the grain of what we thought was true and maybe true nationally, that they're just, there's some surprising results, just the number of A grades that are happening. The faculty attitudes here, I think, are quite specific. So I think it was really important for us that we did spend the time we did gathering data, building the dashboard, sharing the information with faculty, allowing the faculty discussions. Here's the situation. What do you want to do about it? Now, we have a very strong system of faculty governance here, but it was really important for us to lay the groundwork with really understanding what is the problem to the extent that we have one. And, is there a problem at all about the number of high grades that we're giving? And then how do we want to address it in a context specific way? We have involved students in the conversation, but we also are understanding that they're still very caught on that sort of hamster wheel of just thinking they need to strive for the highest thing, whatever that is. And we're really trying to provide a way to ease off of that. And so that we've had a lot of productive discussions with students. But this has really been a faculty-led thing, and really looking at the data specific to your own institution to determine, do you have a problem? What is the problem? And what would be the best way to address it for your context?
Right. And really what I've heard from both of you is making sure that the voices that are impacted by this get a chance to weigh in on the conversation. Do you ever have situations where the faculty and the students are actually in the same conversation, getting a chance to hear each other's perspective? And do you feel that, I mean, I'm kind of curious as how that has helped advance this conversation or not advance this conversation, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, all of our faculty committees that affect students directly have student members, voting members on the committees. And so the conversations in those groups are always the most informative, thinking about how the students are responding to what faculty kind of take for granted in a lot of cases. And then in special initiatives and task forces, we often involve students, and we have town halls that are mixed. And I think the more you can get students and faculty in conversation with each other, examining their assumptions, the better.
Yeah, I think the student faculty town halls have been so important to bringing the community to a kind of consensus here. It's been really important that we have faculty and students in the same room, and that people are able to hear the diversity of perspectives on both sides, that it's not that all faculty believe one thing and all students believe one thing, because it's clearly not that simple. So that's been really productive.
I have been trying my best to keep up with the questions in the chat. I don't know that I'm doing the greatest job. So if there's anyone who wants to raise their hand and ask a question of our panelists, I would welcome that. I obviously have some others that I do, but I know that there's been some good questions that are asked. I've tried to weave some of those thoughts in. But if you have something that you feel you would like to ask, come up. Yeah, Angela, please. And can you at least let you know where you're from, please?
Yeah, I'm from the University of Michigan.
Hey.
And we've been thinking about, we had great conversations with our colleagues from MIT, and we're thinking about a grade covering pilot for the first year involving our very large College of Arts and Sciences. So it's kind of funny that we call it a pilot, given the scale of the thing. But this conversation and the conversations we're having here, I mean, it's interesting to me that we're so fixated on the A. Where I've been thinking about why for first year students, I mean, what's the argument for having them have an F on a public and on a permanent and outward facing transcript, or an F that follows them their entire academic career? I mean, so if we were going to do so, it seems to me that, there's an argument for just ditching the F, especially for first year students, kind of go, as they get acclimated and as they're doing different things. So it's a question about the other side of the scale. So not the A, but thinking more about the F.
Yeah, have those sort of conversations come up as the other side of like as Angela said, the other side of the scale?
I mean, we don't allow Fs for first years, so we have that in place. Why we allow them for upper level students, I think we're less clear about, and I think that's something that we would definitely want the grading task force to take a look at. Like, are these Fs functioning? I know that in one respect they are functioning as preventing students from using no record to late drop a class in like the final week of the term, which causes various problems. But other than that, I think they're not serving a super important function.
Yeah, we have E, not F, and it's defined as work that is unworthy of course credit towards the degree. It is very rarely, almost never assigned. And in cases where it would be, I think we have a very generous leaves policy, and I think In those cases where a student is really not able to complete coursework, they can take a leave of absence at any point during the semester. They can convert a class to pass-fail and hopefully, kind of just get over the bar for that course, or they can withdraw from the course, which is also a very frequently, used option. So while we do have the E on our books, it's very rarely applied. And we also have a series of courses that are graded SAT, UNSAT. That's a different category we have that are aimed at first years. So our Computer Science 50 is a SAT, UNSAT default course. We have first year seminars that are all SAT, UNSAT. So we do very much try to avoid that for our students. It is still technically on our books, but you raise a great point, Angela, that, why if we're not using it? So.
And maybe I'll, it's a question that has just come up from Michael Palmer at UVA. I'll kind of ask it where, the framing of all of this obviously has kind of been the view that giving letter grades or giving some sort of grades is inevitable. And is it possible for us to have a conversation where that is not, in fact, assumed? And I welcome from your conversations and your thoughts about, and how would we go about having that conversation where we just don't assume that these grades that we have been doing is an inevitable part of what we do? Are we ready for that, do you think? Do you think we're ready for that?
I mean, I think if the med schools get on board, we could be ready for that, but it's a whole system-wide thing, not an institution level question, I think.
I think so too. I think we have been frustrated by the extent to which medical school seems to drive all these conversations and constrain us from doing what we would really like to do. So I think we have thought of it as an area where we could perhaps take leadership with the medical schools. If we wanted to make a change, I think we see that there's an opportunity to educate our external partners about what the Harvard grades mean if they're not going to be letter grades anymore. I think we have felt that's something we would take on. In our exploration of, we called it alternative grading scheme. So we did look at all courses being SAT on SAT or pass fail. We did look at moving to a strictly numerical system. Harvard did have a 16-point grading scale in the past, so it was, not letter grades at all. So I don't think we're afraid of looking at alternative ways of expressing grades. I think for this moment, we felt that some kind of collective action around our current, published grading scale in the faculty handbook was the right move. But I wouldn't say that, if this doesn't pass or if it doesn't work, I think we'll have to think of the next thing. And I think we would be open to thinking about some radical alternatives, Archie.
And what's put in the chat is the irony, of course, is that once students are in medical school, they usually are not graded on letter grade based systems. They're usually graded pass fail, which is the irony of all of this. Before I turn it back over to Gillian to close us out, do you have last thoughts that you would like to share with this group again as we continue to have conversations around grading and assessment? And Kate, I'll start with you first. Any last words of wisdom before I close us out?
I would just say thank you for everyone who's considering this. I think, as we talked about, this is a system level problem. And if we want to create a radical new system where grades are really genuinely measuring learning and indicating what skills and knowledge students have acquired, we can. UERU is a great space to start that conversation and continue that conversation and hopefully make some change.
Gillian?
Yeah, thank you. I also just want to say thanks for the invitation to for this conversation today. We are in, I think in an unusual position in some way with the number of A grades that are being given out at Harvard. So I wouldn't say that our solution would be for everyone, but that in general, the question of making sure that we're giving students good feedback on learning, however we do it, and designing great courses where students can succeed, where all students can master learning objectives. I think that's our collective goal. So I'm really excited to participate in all the future conversations that you are organizing to learn more about best ways to do that.
And again, I want to thank you both for taking time out to have this initial conversation with me. In response to something put in the chat, part of the reason why Michael and I wanted to have this conversation with a group like UERU is we recognize, as Kate said, this can't be a single institution by single institution. This has to be a system-wide change. And who else than the over 100 R1 and R2 institutions that are part of UERU to maybe come together and do that collectively? And I do wonder, as somebody said, what would happen if all of the members of URU stop giving grades? Like, what would actually happen? It's an interesting thought experiment that maybe we will have a chance to dive into later in some of our other conversations to get thoughts about all of that. But again, Kate, Gillian, thank you very much for joining us. And Julia, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thank you, Archie, and thank you all for such a robust discussion, both our speakers, Gillian, Kate, Michael, Archie, and also everyone who contributed in the chat. Thank you all. Just a couple of notes, in case you missed it, we had a podcast episode with Josh Eiler, who wrote the book on this, and you can find it in the chat, our recent Reinventing You podcast episode. I believe Josh is here today, so welcome, Josh. And there's some information in the chat as well about our next town hall, which will be with UT Knoxville. Thank you all for being here. Have a great rest of your day and keep things going in the MyURU discussion platform if you want to keep the conversation going.